Okay, so three basic kinds of funnels you might see, for example. Somebody going to the landing page, then doing a site search, then finding a product, then checking out, and finally completing their purchase, right? Clicking buy it now or whatever, checkout. Alternatively, you might do a very similar path, like going to a landing page and then doing a menu tool, and then finding a product and checking out and getting the purchase confirmation. Or you might get to the site from a search engine and then, again, find a product page, go through the checkout, go through the purchase completion. So all of these creates a bit of a problem for websites. What they fundamentally want to do, right? Let's track the different paths to completion. So here is, thanks for buying at the end. And then we have another step here, that's initiate checkout. Checkout starts. And then up here is product page. But the question is, how do they get to this point? Right, so what we want to do in our funnel setups is have the ability to consider a variety of different paths of getting to this point. So Google Analytics, one thing that they let you do is have a first step required option in a funnel. So for example, if you get there from site search, results, or you get there from just straight from the landing page, or you've used some, some tool for menus, whatever, any of those particular options you have to get to the product page, you want to be able to distinguish those different paths. Okay, but then perhaps downstream from that, they all basically go the same way. So this lets you consider these paths separately. For example, if you find that site search is leading a lot more people to this final step than, say, menu tools or even bypassing it, well, you want to make the site search very prominent. You want to make it easily findable for people. So simple things like that. Of course, you can also do it, as a variety of landing pages. Number 1, number 2, number 3. So however many versions of the landing page you have, you can also set those up as separate funnels and say, oh, maybe one of these landing pages is a bit more relevant to this particular setup. Okay, so those are some simple examples there. We can also talk in general terms about different business models. So for example, two big online sites, eBay and Amazon. eBay, I hope everyone knows, is primarily an auction site, whereas Amazon is primarily a retail site. Now, sure, they have their different things, right? eBay, you can have a buy it now option and people can set up stores there. And Amazon, people can do, Amazon carries third-party sellers that could potentially fluctuate their price. But, these basic business models are true. eBay is for auctions, Amazon is for retailing. So when you think about how their sites are set up, you might consider, well, how are their transactions the same? How are they different? And what non-purchase activities are important? And how all that bundles together into their funnel designs. So for example, eBay, typically people are going to view multiple auctions, right? They're going to view one auction page, then place a bid, buy, continue browsing, and eventually exit. So they'll potentially look at a bunch of auctions, bid on one or more of them, and then they're done. So the funnel model for eBay is very different, right? Is basically, in a sense, looking at each auction is like looking at a product page, okay? Bidding is like actually buying something, right? Because the highest bid goes up. If you bid lower than the highest bid on something, it doesn't register. You have to bid a higher bid to get it, right? Because the highest bid goes up. So in a sense, it's a very different model. And basically, eBay can track each successful bid as a goal, right? Meaning that each path to an auction becomes like a funnel. Okay, so they have a different thing. They potentially have multiple funnel visits over the course of a single visit, right? Whereas Amazon, Amazon, very different. And more conventional. Each visit may result in one or more products added to the cart, and at the end, the complete purchase is made. Right? So essentially, one goal, buying something, and basically one funnel. Okay, so a person gets there, then within this area, right? So instead of having one product page, Amazon is basically blowing this up. We can do a bunch of little squares in here, right? Over the course of the visit, maybe looking at multiple product pages, and some of them you buy something and some of them you don't. So anyway, they're a little different. So different websites, if it's something where you typically maybe go to the site and you buy one thing or you don't, it's going to be different. For example, if you go to a services site and the goal of the services site is to get you to schedule an appointment, right? For example, a dentist or home repair, I don't know, garage installation, door installation, whatever. The goal of going to that site is simply to set up the appointment. And then once that's done, well, that's considered a positive thing. Whereas Amazon, potentially lots of different activities, but still encompassed within one funnel. And on eBay, really the entire visit becomes a cluster of funnels. So depending on how your site is set up and how your business model is, right, you might need a simpler or more complicated view of what a funnel is. All right. Okay, so that's what I had to say about funnels. Next thing, filters. So filters are a neat tool in Google Analytics that basically lets you exclude certain data from your reports. So anytime you're checking data, you'll have a whole bunch of customers, for example, you know, going through some path. But with filters, you can filter out. I'm trying to grab the green, but I keep hitting this thing. Okay. Filters can remove irrelevant data from your reports. For example, internal site visitors, like designers. Okay, so people that are going to the website itself to see how it looks, they're navigating these paths, using these tools to see how they work, they're testing the landing pages. All that's not real traffic, right? You want to prune that out. Likewise, or known bots, right? You might say, oh, I'm getting a lot of weird traffic from overseas that doesn't really make any sense, right? Maybe that's from some overseas search engine doing it. I know on my Doug Corp site, there was a window where I was strangely getting a lot of traffic out of Moscow. I don't know why, but I imagine some kind of bot scouring around to see what I was doing on my site. Or known bots, that's another option, or just geographically irrelevant, right? So for example, suppose you're selling a service that is very local, like restaurant delivery, okay? Nobody's going to look at that site from the other side of the world and, you know, expect you to deliver a pizza to, say, Japan. Just not going to happen. So when you're looking at your website, you might prune that data as well. You might focus in only on the data that's in, say, the Chicagoland area, or even in even tighter region if you can manage it. So that's what filters are good for. Now, depending on how it's set up, you could either exclude some set of data that you don't want to see, or you could exclude everything except that. And the choice, I mean, functionally they're equivalent, right? You could say, I'm including this, or I'm excluding everything but this. You can always phrase it one way, but typically one is going to be much easier to express than the other. For example, if you want to remove a small set of, say, 10 IP addresses, or a simple range of IP addresses, it's a lot easier to express that group and have it removed than it is to express every other possible IP address in the universe. The other thing about filtering is permanent. Okay, unlike almost everything else in Google where your data exists in one big pile and you can choose to look at some subset of it without affecting the pile itself, filtering is permanent. So if you apply a filter to your data, it permanently gets rid of that data. So what you need to do in Google Analytics, you have basically copies of your data called views. Okay, let's make a note of that. To filter safely without losing original data, use a new view, which is just a copy of your data, and apply the filter there. Okay, so I'll show you how this works in the actual site itself. Let's bring up analytics. Okay, so if I want to do that, I go over to admin and I can apply a filter. All right, so here for mine, I have a bunch of, this is my basic view. So if I want to, I could create a new view. Let's create a new view. Okay, so I'm going to call it Fall 2020. I create it. Every semester or so, I create a new view. And then on that one, right, so here's the one I'm on now. If I want to apply a filter to it, I could, for example, add a filter and say, oh, let's say, what shall I do? I don't know, new filter. So I could select filter type. I could say, I'll do an exclusion filter. Well, what do I want to exclude? Traffic from the IP addresses? Sure. Okay. Traffic from the IP address that's equal to 127.0.0.1. Okay, that's your local host address. So I can say anything that, you know, is from this local machine will not be included. Okay. Anyway, so that's how you would apply filters. And of course, there's a lot more detail to it. You can set it for different groups, different ranges of URLs, different domains and such. But that's the simple idea. If you have some data that you don't want to see in your reports, you can apply a filter to remove it. Okay. So we talked about that. Okay. So exclusion filters are generally used if there's irrelevant data, like data from far away you don't care about, or bytes, or bots rather, or internal traffic. Inclusion filters are appropriate when you only want to see a small portion of your data. For example, site visitors who are from geographically nearby locations, right? Or if you want to really deeply analyze a specific segment of your data, then you could apply a filter there. Okay. Next big thing, monetization. So monetization is simply the process of trying to figure out how much your traffic is worth. So how much individual customers are worth and how much their individual actions are worth. Because in the end, most sites that are using web analytics, they're doing it in order to improve the value of their site. So anything they can do to assess how valuable customer traffic is allows them to better target their ads and redesign their site to improve those results. But there's a lot of questions about how much these actions are worth, how they should be measured, and how reliable the measurements are. Okay, now everything can be monetized. The value of a visit, for example, if you identify that a typical customer visit, say 90% of your customers don't buy anything, but 1 out of every 10 buys a basket of goods that is worth, say, $50. And off of that $50, you make $5 profit. So then since 10% of your customers, 10% of your visits are making you $5 each, you can reasonably say that each individual visit on average is worth about 50 cents to your site. Okay, other things like browsing, how many pages people look at, the more pages people look at often, the more money they're going to spend. and likewise the value of purchases. So everything that people do on your site, you can put a price tag on it. But of course, these things don't remain stable over time and they're hard to measure in the first place. For example, the value of the variables themselves could change over time, right? Maybe at first you see 1 in 10 customers is buying something. Maybe that goes up to 1 in 5. Maybe it goes down to 1 in 20. And maybe over time, the value of the mix of goods they're buying is changing. So all of that stuff is constantly variable, and you have to track it. And especially if you're a business that's growing quickly, all those numbers can change very rapidly. Other contextual factors, like maybe you did a big advertising campaign on a particular product, and in the short term it's selling well, but you know, next month you're doing something else, you suddenly find, oh, that product that we had advertised a lot before, sales have dropped off. Okay, so the simplest way to do it is the way I described before, which is basically just prorating any activity over the number of times it happens. But this gets a little bit trickier when you have to consider a whole batch of activities. For example, right, and I don't want to get deep into the math into it because it's not that kind of class, but we'll just talk about a simple question, right? So how to value visitor actions. Okay, so the first one, suppose you have 1,000 visitors who collectively buy, I don't know, $100,000 of goods, of products. Okay, that's great. So each visitor ought to be worth about $100 in sales. So that's a starting point there, right? But suppose you break it down further. Suppose you break it down further, right? So that those 1,000 visitors collectively have seen, let's say, 5,000 pages, okay, and clicked on, I don't know, 4,000 images. How much are each of those activities worth, right? Basically, what share corresponds to the visits, to the page views, and to the clicks, right? And this is not a trivial mathematical problem to solve. It can be solved, but it's not trivial. So anyway, you'd need to develop a monetization model that encompasses all these. Now, what you might do, you might, for example, start at the most fine-grained actions. Clicks, right? Because each click, multiple clicks can happen on a page. So you might say, well, each click is worth, what, 100,000 out of 4,000. Each click is worth $25 if you calculate it independently of page views and visits, right? And you might say, well, nobody's clicking on anything unless they see a page, and nobody's seeing a page unless they visit a site, so it's already bundled in there, right? But the point is, but that's not the only way to set up your model, right? So there are many possibilities. Okay, so that's what I want to say. There's not one right answer. There's a bunch of different models you can make that can fit this limited amount of data you have. I saw there was a chat thing there. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, good morning. Okay. Okay, so that's it. So there are some troubles. Now, one way to do it is with a simple regression model that you can pile up all your data and bring it all together into what's called multivariate regression, So if you've taken IDS 270, you've done simple linear regression, for example, where you use one variable's value to predict the values of another. You can do a similar kind of thing where you have multiple input variables, multiple independent variables predicting a single dependent variable. So that's one possibility. Same thing with event tracking. Again, finer grained analysis is possible. You get more data about all this, makes your model more complicated too. And on top of that, the question of monetization, how do you assess the value of potential return visits? You know that somebody who visits the site, looks at a product, doesn't buy it today, might still come back in a couple days, a week, a month, and buy it later. So how do you evaluate that? Well, the obvious answer is to look at what's happened in the past and extrapolate that forward. So if you find that, you know, basically something like this, I'm going to draw a picture. And say that, okay, you had so many visits here, right? And those visits at that point led to some sort of outcome in terms of sales, like this going forward. There's some batch that happens a little later that way. Well, then you might plausibly guess, unless you have a good reason not to, that if you see another block of visits like this, that the probable outcome from those sales is just basically going to be about double that other one and stretched out over roughly the same amount of time. So that's the sort of model that typically gets assumed. Okay, we're getting towards the end here. So a couple things. We'll talk about Google Tag Manager. Google Tag Manager is some supplementary software to Google Analytics. It was released about 8 years ago now. Wow, where's the time go? And designed for compatibility with other Google products like Analytics and AdWords and many others. Now, it does provide some of the same analytics features as Google Analytics as far as event tracking, but it is distinct. It's its own product. The main thing of tag management software is this. If you have a web page, if you have a web page, you're going to have some blocks of code on there. I'll put a little JS here. HTML. You have that code that does whatever you want to get tracked on that page, right? But suppose, and if you have one page, it's not a problem to go in there and edit it and make it happen. But if you have 1 million pages, or like Amazon, literally maybe 3 billion product pages, you're just not going to do all that by hand. Okay, instead, you create a database of code, and pages will pull that code when they load. Okay, so instead you have a whole bunch of pages, and every one of those pages, it says there'll be some reference in here, use this particular set of HTML and JavaScript when this page item gets loaded. Okay, that's basically what Tag Manager software does. It creates a repository of these sort of tags that then you can store that and have the pages read them, as opposed to going through each and every individual page and editing it separately. That's why Google Tag Manager is a separate and supplementary product to Google Analytics. Okay, so what are tags? Well, we've already seen the page tags for Google Analytics. They're sometimes also called tracking pixels. So these tags basically are little bits of code that provide other extra functions like sending data to third parties like Google. So the basic mechanism is this. You have a small image or some other bit of data that's retrieved from a server, right? That's why they call them tracking pixels. So the fact that there was a server call, that indicates, oh, somebody did whatever was needed to pull that single image from the server. This is the way that they track emails. Who clicked and opened emails is because if the email contains an embedded image or some other content that has to be pulled from the server, it's uniquely specified for that email directly to you, so the server knows, oh, you pulled this email. That's how some outside source can know when and where you opened it. Okay, so again, and other objects can serve the same role as pixels. So tracking tags, tracking pixels, mean the same thing. Okay, now tag management software provides all these features for simplifying the work associated with tags. So instead of having to go through, if you want to change a tag, go through to every web page and do it manually, instead, every time you load the page, you just pull it from this database, and then you only have one copy of the tag. You only have to change that one in the database, and it's automatically echoed to all future versions of the page. Other nice thing is they can more easily work through scripts instead of the HTML code. In most cases, that'll mean your site will run faster. Okay, and then also important thing, uniformity of code. You're less likely to make mistakes in translation because you're just going to be reading it from the database. Okay, containers. Container is the virtual structure that contains all these tags. So again, if you're using Google Tag Manager, these tags all go somewhere. Okay, they get stored in a database. Now, if you're not using Tag Manager software, yeah, you could create some list of your own of all the different copies of the tags you wanted. It wouldn't be virtual anymore, though. It would be simply a long list of tag possibilities. But for containers, this thing, the container tag is something you put on every page that's using tags, right? Just basically that big slug of, 5 or 6 lines of JavaScript code you put down at the bottom. So if I look at my Doug Corp site, you can find that. I view the source code here. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom, this is it. This script here, this is my container that basically tells Google where all the code is going. Well, it tells my page where the code is going to go, and where it goes to is Google. Okay, so again, this sort of thing, this container tag, I can apply this on every page that I want to send data to my Google account. So again, makes it very simple. I don't have to write a custom object to it to process it in some custom way. I just have a standard way to process all of the events that happen on that page, and they all go to the same place. All right, so if I had a big site with many, many pages, again, I could just put that copy of that same container tag on every page rather than having to code it out of nothing. Okay, tag firing and triggers. So basic things there. Tag firing means it does whatever it's supposed to do. For example, it sends a notification, basically it sends a notification to Google that this thing happened. A trigger is the action that causes a tag to fire. For example, a page view. You can set up a tag that says, when somebody loads this page, it's considered to have been viewed, and sends the notification to Google. Or if there's a timer, if somebody spends a minute on the page, as soon as the page is loaded, that timer starts counting down. Once it hits 0, again, sends that notification to Google. Okay, and you can do other things. You can combine it with filters. For example, you can have a tag only fire under certain circumstances, right? So if the user is from a particular set of IP addresses, or if it's at a certain time of day, whatever. And you can also do rate limiting. So for example, you could have a tag that fires only once per visit or every time the trigger happens. So for example, things like image clicks, typically you're interested in whether the click happened or not. You're not interested in the number of image clicks themselves. Within Google Tag Manager, every tag needs at least one trigger. If it doesn't have a trigger, then it doesn't have a way that it's going to fire. So in order to embed it into the system itself, you have to define a tag as saying, here's what its trigger is. Okay, the rest of this is just a few things about interpretation. So we'll kind of zip over this because we don't really have the time for it, and it's a little mathematical anyway. So key things, hidden variable models. In general, you don't know exactly what's going on your site. So I'm just going to talk about how this works in the real world, and then in the physical world, and then we'll talk about how it translates to Google Analytics. So in a physical store, you would have visitors arriving, and then eventually leaving, right? So and then some of them have spent some money, some not. But you don't really know all this stuff, right? You don't know how the visitors arrived. You don't know how they got there. You don't know exactly what they're doing while they're in the store. And you don't know the factors that lead to some of them spending money and others not. You'd like to know, but you don't. Other things you have in a web store though, right? So website, you don't know all these things, but you know some, right? For example, you can see things like the ad that was clicked on, right? How they got there. And you can also see which pages were viewed and for how long and which images clicked and so on. Okay, so you do have a lot more information about what's working and what isn't working. Anyway, but there's still always a lot of questions. You don't know exactly the mechanisms, what makes a viewer see a particular page, for example, or what makes them click on a particular image. So there's always a little bit of guesswork in there. You know more than you do in a physical store, but you don't know everything. Okay, so the task of web analytics people is to identify and influence a set of factors that lead to good outcomes. For example, figuring out which ads work better, which site design works better than another, which page structure works better, things like that. Okay, so there's a lot of measurement challenges. One thing, small sample size. If you want to check, for example, how a particular page is doing, it might take a while to get enough traffic on that page to make a really good decision about it. And the more often you do this kind of A/B testing, again, it's all going to take time if you want to build a reasonable sample size. Other possibilities, you may have non-random samples, right? You may get clusters of people visiting a particular page that are not like the other people that visit your site. And of course, limited history. You don't always have a long time to figure these things out. Some other things, paired variables, quite often changing one metric on your site is going to make another worse. For example, if you do something on your site, if you offer a substantial discount, like say you say 25% if you buy stuff now, sure, more customers are going to buy stuff right away. But what that'll mean in the long run, people tend to have about the same budget for stuff over time. So it means they're probably going to make fewer visits, but when they do buy visits, they're more likely to buy something. So again, by offering this paired variable, by offering this discount option, sure, you're going to increase the amount that people buy during that visit, but they're going to buy it less often. Other things too, right? If you expand a wider net, send ads out all over the place, sure, you'll get more visitors to your site, which sounds good, but your conversion rate is probably going to drop because the fact that you're getting more traffic and casting a wider net means, that means you're simply not targeting your best customers. All right. Other things, diminishing returns. Well, that's the same thing. The more you expand your reach on your ads, you're going to get your second best customers. All right. And privacy, other stuff. So it is possible to track visitors individually using their IP addresses, even in Google Analytics. It is possible to do it, but just because you can do something, like we know in many cases in real life, because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So number one, your site visitors are likely to be unhappy about that, right? They're going to say, oh man, they're tracking me personally. Why would they do that? What do they want to know? I don't know if I should go back there. Many firms and countries, in fact, even have privacy policies that are opposed to individual tracking. US tends to not worry about that too much. Other countries in Europe, for example, often very concerned. Now, specific to Google Analytics, it uses the IP addresses to compile all the geographic data. So think of it as analogous to phone numbers. They can use IP addresses to figure out the approximate geographic location of a user. But Google only uses part of the IP address, so they can figure out what region you're from or what metropolitan area, but they're not going to find a particular house that you're from. Again, you can do that on your site if you want to, but customers are likely to react negatively. Okay. I know we kind of had to zip through the end there. We'll come back. We'll talk about, we have these case studies. I'm going to stop this.